What if I told you that 30,000 years ago, humans were doing things so horrifying, so unthinkable, that modern forensic scientists still lose sleep studying the evidence? The Stone Age wasn't just about making fire and hunting mammoths. It was about survival at any cost. And that cost was darker than you can imagine. Deep in a Siberian cave, archaeologists found something that changed everything we thought we knew about Stone Age humans. A perfectly crafted bone needle, 50,000 years old, lay beside the skeletal remains of a child. But this wasn't just any needle. The bone had been carved from a human femur. Microscopic analysis revealed tiny fragments of sinew still threaded through the eye. The positioning suggested the child had been sewn into their burial shroud while still alive, their small hands clutching the very tool used to seal their fate. What's more disturbing is that this practice wasn't isolated. Similar needles have been found across 3 continents, always with children's remains. The precision of the stitching patterns suggests these weren't mercy killings, but elaborate rituals that required the victim to remain conscious throughout the entire process. The final twist? Carbon dating shows these burials happened during harsh winters. The children weren't just sacrificed, they were likely chosen because their smaller bodies would conserve the tribe's food supplies through the darkest months of the year. Chapter 2: The Teeth That Tell Tales. In 2019, dental analysis of Neanderthal remains revealed something that made forensic experts sick. The wear patterns on their teeth showed they had been used as tools for gripping human flesh while it was stripped from bones. Not for eating, for processing. The microscopic scratches indicated a sawing motion, consistent with removing skin and muscle from living victims. The angle of the wear suggested the victims were restrained face up, while Neanderthals used their teeth like primitive scalpels, slowly removing layers of tissue. Most disturbing were the tooth marks found on children's skulls from the same sites. The bite patterns matched adult Neanderthal dental impressions perfectly. These weren't quick kills. The multiple bite marks suggest prolonged sessions where children were kept alive during the flaying process. Chemical analysis of the tooth enamel revealed traces of human tears and saliva, suggesting the victims were conscious and crying throughout their ordeal. The Neanderthals weren't just cannibals, they were methodical torturers who used their own bodies as instruments of prolonged agony. Chapter 3: The Cave of Screaming Skulls. Hidden beneath the French countryside lies a cave that archaeologists refuse to fully explore. Inside, hundreds of human skulls line the walls, each one showing evidence of trepanation, holes drilled into living skulls. But these weren't medical procedures. The bone analysis reveals the holes were created slowly over multiple sessions. Tool marks indicate the drilling stopped whenever the victim lost consciousness, then resumed when they awakened. Some skulls show up to 12 separate drilling attempts, suggesting victims survived multiple sessions. What makes this truly horrifying is the acoustic design of the cave. The natural rock formations amplify sound, meaning every scream would echo for minutes. Scratch marks on the cave walls match human fingernails, showing victims clawed at the stone while being operated on. The most chilling discovery came from the deepest chamber. Children's skulls, some as young as 5, showed the same drilling patterns. Their smaller skulls had been modified to create different musical tones when air passed through the holes.
turning tortured children into living wind instruments.
Chapter 4: The Infant Bone Tools. At a Stone Age site in Germany, archaeologists uncovered workshops filled with tools made from infant bones. These weren't random discoveries. They were organized manufacturing sites where babies were systematically processed into implements for daily use. The bones showed specific butchering techniques designed to keep infants alive during the initial stages of processing. Leg bones were removed first, cauterized to prevent bleeding, allowing the infant to survive while their limbs were carved into needles and awls. Microscopic analysis revealed that many infants lived for days after their initial dismemberment. Their remaining bones show healing attempts, proving they were kept alive throughout the tool-making process. Their skulls were the last to be harvested, turned into bowls and cups. The workshop sites contained holding areas with tiny restraints, suggesting a systematic approach to infant processing. Carbon dating shows these facilities operated for centuries, meaning generations of Stone Age people participated in this industrial-scale torture and murder of their own children.
Chapter 5: The Blood-Soaked Middens. Garbage dumps from Stone Age settlements tell a story that makes modern serial killers look merciful. These middens contain layers of human remains mixed with everyday trash, but the positioning reveals something more sinister than simple body disposal. The human bones are always found in specific arrangements. Femurs crossed over rib cages, skulls nested inside pelvic bones. This wasn't random dumping, but deliberate artistic expression using dismembered corpses. Each layer represents a different composition created by ancient psychopaths. What's most disturbing is the evidence of audience participation. Footprints preserved in the hardened earth around these bone sculptures show groups of people gathered to view the displays. Children's footprints are mixed among the adults, suggesting entire families attended these morbid exhibitions. The final layer of each midden always contains infant remains arranged in spiral patterns. Chemical analysis shows these babies were killed specifically for the artwork. Their bones bear no signs of disease or natural death, just clean cuts from stone blades wielded by their own community.
Chapter 6: The Cannibalistic Pregnancy Rituals. Stone Age fertility rituals involved practices so horrific that modern anthropologists struggle to publish their findings. Pregnant women weren't just honored, they were hunted by their own tribes in elaborate ceremonies that lasted for weeks. The ritual began when a woman showed signs of pregnancy. She would be stripped naked and released into the wilderness, given only stone tools and a head start. The tribe would then hunt her like prey, but with a crucial rule: she had to be kept alive until the baby was born. Archaeological evidence shows these hunts covered vast distances. Campsites along ancient migration routes contain restraint devices specifically designed for pregnant women, posts with shackles positioned to keep them upright while their swollen bellies were accessible to the tribe. The most horrifying discovery came from birthing sites. Stone altars stained with blood contained grooves designed to channel fluids away from newborns. The mothers were forced to give birth while being slowly consumed alive, their flesh feeding the tribe while they watched their babies being prepared for the same fate. Chapter 7: The Living Skin Cloaks. In the frozen wastes of ancient Siberia, archaeologists discovered burial chambers containing Stone Age humans wearing cloaks made from still living human skin. The preservation was so perfect that individual hair follicles remained active, continuing to grow for thousands of years after death.
The skin cloaks weren't taken from corpses. They were carefully flayed from living victims in single, continuous pieces. The technique required keeping the donor alive throughout the entire process, which could take up to 3 days of continuous work. Microscopic examination revealed that the skin remained partially alive even after removal, connected to the wearer through an elaborate system of sinew threads that merged with their own circulatory system. The cloak literally became part of its new host's body. The victims who provided these living skins were kept conscious throughout the flaying process, using primitive stimulants made from fermented plants. Their screams were considered essential to the ritual. Silence meant the magic had failed, and the process had to begin again with a fresh victim.
Chapter 8: The Child Chimney Sacrifices. Deep within Stone Age cave systems, narrow vertical shafts contain the compressed remains of hundreds of children. These weren't accidental deaths. They were systematic sacrifices carried out with mechanical precision that would make modern engineers marvel. The children were lowered into these natural chimneys feet first, their arms bound above their heads. As more bodies were added, the weight compressed those below, creating layers of flattened human remains. The process was designed to keep the bottom victims alive as long as possible. Archaeological evidence shows this wasn't a one-time event, but a regular practice spanning centuries. Seasonal markers indicate children were sacrificed during specific times of year, their compressed bodies forming a calendar of death that guided tribal activities. The most disturbing aspect is the acoustic engineering. The shaft dimensions were carefully calculated to amplify the sounds of dying children, creating a resonance that could be heard throughout the cave system. The tribe literally used tortured children as a communication system, with different pitches indicating different messages. Chapter 9: The Bone Marrow Farms. Stone Age settlements in Eastern Europe contained specialized facilities for harvesting bone marrow from living humans. These weren't crude torture chambers, but sophisticated operations that maximized marrow production while keeping victims alive for months. The process began by breaking victims' long bones in specific patterns that expose the marrow while maintaining blood flow. The breaks were then held open with carved bone spreaders, allowing continuous marrow extraction without killing the donor. Victims were kept in specially designed restraint systems that prevented movement while allowing access to all major bone groups. The restraints show wear patterns indicating months of use, proving that individuals survived the prolonged harvesting process. The harvested marrow wasn't used for food, but for creating a paste that preserved human flesh for long-term storage. Analysis shows this paste kept human meat edible for over a year, suggesting these Stone Age people were planning extended periods of cannibalism with industrial efficiency. Chapter 10: The Screaming Mummy Makers. Long before Egyptian mummification, Stone Age tribes practiced preservation techniques that involved keeping victims conscious throughout the entire process. These early embalmers understood that fear-induced chemical changes improved preservation quality. The process began with the careful removal of internal organs while the victim remained awake. Stone tools were used to make precise incisions, and the victim's own fat was rendered and used as a preservation medium while they watched their body being processed. The most horrific aspect was the brain removal technique. Instead of going through the nose like Egyptians, Stone Age embalmers accessed the brain through the eye sockets while the victim could still see. The process took hours, with the victim remaining conscious almost until the end. Preserved vocal cords in some specimens show they were modified to produce specific sounds even after death. These mummified victims were turned into musical instruments, their preserved throats manipulated to create haunting melodies that echoed through cave systems for generations. Chapter 11. The Living Architecture. Stone Age builders didn't just use human bones as construction materials. They used living humans as structural elements in their buildings. Archaeological sites across Europe reveal foundations where people were buried alive to serve as permanent supports. These human pillars weren't quick burials. Evidence shows victims were positioned upright and slowly covered with earth and stone, allowing them to remain conscious throughout the building process. Their struggles actually strengthened the foundation as their movements compressed the material around them. The most disturbing sites contain entire families buried together as single structural elements. Parents were forced to watch their children being slowly buried alive beside them, their combined terror and desperation creating psychological bonds that supposedly strengthened the building's spiritual foundation. Some structures show evidence of maintenance procedures where living supports were partially excavated and fed to keep them alive longer. These buildings literally grew stronger from the prolonged suffering of their human components, with some victims surviving for months within the walls. Chapter 12. The Taste Test Murders. Stone Age cannibals practiced a selection process that makes modern food critics seem tame. They developed elaborate rituals for determining which humans would provide the best meat, involving taste tests performed on living victims. The process began with small cuts made to various parts of the victim's body. Tasters would sample the raw flesh while the person remained conscious, rating different areas for flavor and texture. This preliminary testing could go on for days. The most prized cuts were determined through systematic torture that stressed different muscle groups. Victims were forced to perform specific physical activities while being periodically sampled, as the tribe believed fear and exhaustion improved the meat's flavor profile. Children were subjected to special preparation rituals designed to tenderize their meat through controlled trauma. They were kept in small enclosures where they could only move in specific ways, molding their developing muscles into preferred shapes while maximizing their psychological distress. Chapter 13. The Echo Chamber Executions. Stone Age tribes discovered that certain cave formations could amplify human screams to supernatural levels. They built execution chambers in these locations, turning death into an acoustic weapon that could be heard for miles. The condemned weren't killed quickly. They were subjected to procedures designed to maximize vocal expression. Torturers used techniques that caused intense pain without damaging the vocal cords, ensuring the screams remained strong throughout the ordeal. These echo chambers were strategically positioned near enemy territories. The amplified sounds of dying victims served as psychological warfare, with some screaming sessions lasting for days as victims were kept alive through primitive medical intervention. The most sophisticated chambers contained multiple victims positioned at different acoustic focal points. Their combined screams created harmonies that could drive listeners insane,
with some enemy tribes abandoning their territories after prolonged exposure to the manufactured sounds of agony. Chapter 14: The Parasite Farmers. Stone Age medicine included deliberate infection of victims with parasites for ritual and practical purposes. Specialized facilities bred human-specific parasites in living hosts who were kept alive solely to serve as breeding grounds for these creatures. The process involved careful introduction of multiple parasite species into victims' bodies. Different parasites were cultivated in different organs, turning living humans into walking laboratories for biological weapon development. These parasite farms produced creatures that were then introduced into enemy food supplies or used in warfare. The breeding process required keeping hosts alive for months while their bodies were consumed from within by carefully managed infestations. The most horrific aspect was the harvesting process. Parasites were extracted from living hosts without anesthesia, with victims forced to watch their own bodies being mined for the creatures that had been eating them alive for months. Chapter 15: The Memory Thieves. Stone Age shamans practiced primitive brain surgery designed to steal memories from living victims. They believed that traumatic memories contained special power that could be transferred from one person to another. The procedure involved precise trepanation techniques that accessed specific brain regions while keeping the victim conscious. Stone tools were used to probe memory centers, with shamans claiming they could extract specific recollections through physical manipulation. Victims were kept alive throughout multiple brain surgeries as shamans searched for particular memories. The process could take weeks, with daily operations that gradually destroyed the victim's personality while supposedly transferring their experiences to the shaman. Archaeological evidence suggests these memory transfer rituals were performed on children specifically chosen for traumatic experiences. Kids were deliberately tortured to create powerful memories that could then be surgically extracted and absorbed by tribal leaders seeking supernatural knowledge. Chapter 16: The Living Drums. Stone Age music involved instruments made from living humans who were kept alive to serve as resonating chambers for tribal ceremonies. These human drums produce sounds that no dead material could replicate. The process began with surgical modification of victims' body cavities to enhance their acoustic properties. Ribs were carefully broken and repositioned to create internal chambers, while victims remained conscious throughout the restructuring process. These living instruments were played by striking various parts of the modified body, with different areas producing different tones. Victims were trained to control their breathing and muscle tension to create specific sounds on command. The most prized human drums were children whose smaller bodies produced higher pitches. They were subjected to growth-stunting procedures to maintain their tonal qualities, kept in suspended development while serving as living musical instruments for years. Chapter 17: The Fertility Extraction Factories. Stone Age tribes operated facilities dedicated to harvesting reproductive materials from unwilling donors. These weren't simple rape scenarios, but systematic extraction operations that maximized output while keeping donors alive for repeated use. Women were kept in specialized restraint systems that allowed access while preventing escape. The facilities were designed for efficiency, with multiple victims processed simultaneously by teams of extractors working in organized shifts.
The most disturbing aspect was the psychological manipulation involved. Victims were conditioned to believe their cooperation would save their children, who were kept visible but just out of reach as motivation for compliance with the extraction procedures. Men weren't spared from these facilities. They were subjected to procedures designed to maximize reproductive output through controlled trauma that stimulated biological responses while causing maximum psychological distress to both donors and their families. Chapter 18: The Slow Death Specialists. Stone Age executioners developed expertise in prolonging death for ritualistic purposes. They understood human anatomy well enough to keep victims alive for weeks while inflicting continuous, escalating damage. These specialists studied the human body like modern surgeons, learning which injuries would cause maximum pain without immediate death. They developed techniques for maintaining consciousness while systematically destroying non-vital organs and tissues. The process was performed in public, with entire tribes gathering to watch the gradual destruction of condemned individuals. Children were encouraged to participate, learning the techniques that would make them valuable members of their communities. The most skilled practitioners could keep victims alive for over a month while removing limbs, organs, and sensory capabilities in a carefully planned sequence designed to maximize suffering while maintaining awareness throughout the entire ordeal. Chapter 19: The Human Incubators. Pregnant women in Stone Age societies were sometimes used as living incubators for parasites and diseases that the tribe wanted to cultivate. These biological weapons were grown inside unwilling mothers whose pregnancies became secondary to their role as breeding grounds. The process involved deliberately infecting pregnant women with specific pathogens, then monitoring the disease progression while keeping both mother and fetus alive. The goal was to create infected newborns who could be used against enemy tribes. These human incubators were kept in isolation chambers where their conditions could be controlled and monitored. Multiple women were infected simultaneously to increase the chances of successful pathogen cultivation and transmission. The children born from these infected mothers were raised as living biological weapons, carriers of diseases specifically cultivated to target enemy populations. Their entire lives were spent as walking instruments of biological warfare against other human communities. Chapter 20: The Consciousness Trappers. Stone Age shamans believed they could trap dying consciousness inside specially prepared objects. They developed techniques for timing deaths so precisely that the victim's awareness could be captured at the moment of transition. The process required keeping victims in a state between life and death for extended periods while shamans prepared consciousness-trapping devices. Victims experienced the dying process repeatedly, pulled back from death only to be forced through the experience again. These trapped consciousnesses were believed to provide supernatural power to their captors. The objects containing them were used in rituals and warfare, with the trapped awareness supposedly providing guidance and protection to the tribe. The most prized trapped consciousnesses came from children who had been subjected to specific trauma designed to purify their awareness before capture. These young victims experienced prolonged torture designed to strip away everything except pure consciousness before their final moment was trapped forever. Chapter 21: The Bone Garden Cultivators. Stone Age agriculturalists discovered that human bones, when kept partially alive through primitive medical techniques, could be used to grow specialized crops. These bone gardens produced plants that couldn't survive in normal soil. The process involved breaking victims' bones in specific patterns that exposed marrow while maintaining blood flow. The living bone fragments were then planted in specially prepared soil, where they continued to function as nutrient sources for exotic plants. These bone gardens required constant maintenance, with gardeners regularly harvesting marrow and other materials from the still living bone fragments. Victims survived this agricultural process for months, their broken limbs serving as fertilizer for crops that fed their captors. The plants grown in these bone gardens were believed to have supernatural properties derived from human suffering. They were used in rituals and medicine, creating an agricultural system based entirely on the systematic torture of living humans. Chapter 22: The Echo Memory Caves. Stone Age tribes discovered caves with unique acoustic properties that could record and replay human voices. They used these natural recording studios to preserve the screams of their victims for later psychological warfare. The caves required specific conditions to function properly: the right humidity, temperature, and most importantly, the right emotional resonance from the recorded voices. Victims were tortured in precise ways to produce screams that the caves could capture and replay. These recorded screams were used to terrorize enemies and break the morale of rival tribes. The caves could replay the agonized voices of victims for years after their deaths, creating haunted locations that served as permanent psychological weapons. The most effective recordings came from children whose higher-pitched voices created better resonance in the cave systems. Entire families were tortured in these caves to create libraries of human suffering that echoed through the chambers for generations. Chapter 23: The Living Compass Makers. Stone Age navigators created directional instruments using living humans whose bodies were modified to respond to magnetic fields. These human compasses were more accurate than any mechanical device because they incorporated biological sensitivity. The modification process involved implanting iron-rich materials into victims' nervous systems while they remained conscious. The metal was introduced through multiple surgeries that connected it to nerve endings, creating biological circuits that responded to magnetic variations. These living compasses experienced constant pain from the implanted metals, but their suffering was considered necessary for accurate navigation. They were carried on long journeys, their modified nervous systems providing directional guidance through their expressions of pain. The most sensitive human compasses were children whose developing nervous systems could better integrate the metallic implants. They were subjected to the modification process over months, their growing bodies adapting to the foreign materials that would guide their tribe's movements. Chapter 24: The Empathy Extractors. Stone Age psychologists understood that empathy could be surgically removed from living subjects, creating humans capable of extreme cruelty without emotional interference. These empathy extraction procedures produced specialized torturers and killers for tribal warfare. The process involved precise brain surgery that targeted regions responsible for emotional connection and compassion. Victims were kept conscious throughout the procedure, so their personality changes could be monitored and adjusted in real time.
These empathy-extracted individuals became the tribe's most effective warriors and executioners. They could inflict suffering without experiencing the emotional feedback that normally limited human cruelty, making them incredibly efficient at their tasks. The procedure had a high mortality rate, but survivors became valuable tribal resources. Children were specifically targeted for empathy extraction because their developing brains showed better adaptation to the surgical modifications that created perfect human killing machines.
Chapter 25: The Pain Amplification Chambers. Stone Age torturers built specialized chambers designed to amplify physical and emotional pain through environmental manipulation. These rooms used acoustic, visual, and tactile elements to maximize human suffering beyond normal biological limits. The chambers incorporated reflective surfaces that forced victims to watch their own torture from multiple angles simultaneously. The psychological impact of seeing their suffering multiplied visually created additional layers of trauma beyond the physical pain. Temperature and humidity were carefully controlled to enhance pain sensitivity. The chambers could make victims more susceptible to injury while keeping them conscious longer, extending torture sessions far beyond what would normally be survivable. The most sophisticated chambers incorporated other prisoners' screams into the acoustic design. Victims experienced not only their own pain, but were psychologically tortured by the suffering of others, creating cascading waves of trauma that affected multiple people simultaneously. Chapter 26: The Memory Implantation Surgeons. Stone Age mind manipulators developed techniques for implanting false memories into living victims through primitive brain surgery. These implanted memories were designed to create maximum psychological trauma and break victims' sense of reality. The process involved opening the skull and physically manipulating brain tissue while the victim remained conscious. Surgeons would describe traumatic scenarios while probing specific brain regions, attempting to create artificial memories of experiences that never happened. These false memories were often more disturbing than actual trauma because victims couldn't distinguish between real and implanted experiences. The confusion between true and false memories created psychological breakdown that was more effective than simple physical torture. Children were preferred subjects for memory implantation because their developing brains were more susceptible to the surgical manipulation. They were given false memories of betrayal by their own families, creating psychological wounds that would never heal. Chapter 27: The Living Scarification Artists. Stone Age body modification involved keeping victims alive while their skin was slowly carved into elaborate artistic patterns. These living canvases remained conscious throughout the multi-day scarification process that turned their bodies into tribal artwork. The scarification process was designed to maximize both artistic impact and victim suffering. Artists used specially heated stone tools that created precise cuts while cauterizing wounds, preventing death while ensuring maximum pain from each artistic stroke. These living artworks were displayed publicly during the scarification process, with tribe members gathering to appreciate both the artistic skill and the victim's suffering. The social aspect turned torture into entertainment that strengthened tribal bonds. The most elaborate scarification projects took months to complete, with artists working on different body sections in sequence. Victims lived through the entire artistic process, their prolonged suffering considered essential to the spiritual power of the completed artwork.
Chapter 28: The Consciousness Multiplication Experiments. Stone Age shamans attempted to split human consciousness into multiple parts through surgical and ritualistic procedures. They believed they could create multiple versions of the same person existing simultaneously in different bodies. The process involved complex brain surgery, combined with ritualistic procedures designed to fragment victims' sense of self. Multiple operations were performed while shamans chanted and used primitive drugs to alter consciousness during the surgical procedures. Some experiments involved transferring parts of victims' personalities into other people through shared trauma experiences. Groups of victims were tortured simultaneously, while shamans attempted to blend their consciousnesses into collective entities. These consciousness experiments had devastating effects on victims who survived the procedures. Many developed multiple personalities or lost their sense of individual identity entirely, becoming psychological fragments that could barely function as independent humans.
Chapter 29: The Human Weather Stations. Stone Age meteorologists used living humans as biological weather prediction instruments. Victims were subjected to procedures that made their bodies hypersensitive to atmospheric changes, turning them into living barometers that predicted weather through their suffering. The sensitization process involved damaging victims' nervous systems in specific ways that made them react to pressure, humidity, and temperature changes with intense pain. Their suffering provided early warning of weather changes that helped tribes prepare for storms. These human weather stations were kept in exposed locations where they could respond to atmospheric variations. Their reactions to changing conditions were interpreted by tribal weather readers, who used victim responses to guide agricultural and military decisions. Children made the most sensitive weather stations because their nervous systems were more adaptable to the sensitization procedures. They spent their entire lives in constant pain that fluctuated with weather patterns, their suffering serving as meteorological instruments for their communities.
Chapter 30: The Living Food Preservers. Stone Age food storage involved using living humans as biological preservation systems for meat and other perishables. Victims' body chemistry was modified to prevent food spoilage while keeping them alive to maintain the preservation process. The modification process involved surgical insertion of preservation materials into victims' body cavities. These materials interacted with their living systems to create environments that prevented food decay, while causing constant pain to the human preservers. Food was stored inside these living preservation systems, with victims forced to carry rotting meat in their modified body cavities for weeks or months. Their bodies became walking refrigerators that kept food fresh through biological processes powered by their suffering. The most effective preservation systems were created using pregnant women whose body chemistry provided better food storage capabilities. They were forced to carry preserved food instead of their own children, their maternal biology repurposed for tribal food security.
Chapter 31: The Pain Echo Chambers. Stone Age acoustic engineers built chambers that could capture and replay pain responses, creating environments where suffering could be experienced repeatedly by different victims. These pain echo chambers allowed torture to be shared across time and space. The chambers used natural rock formations combined with carved modifications to capture and store the acoustic signatures of extreme pain. Victim screams were recorded in the stone itself to be replayed for future torture sessions. New victims placed in these chambers experienced not only their own pain, but also the replayed suffering of previous occupants. The accumulated agony of multiple torture sessions created psychological environments of unprecedented trauma density. The most horrific chambers contained decades of recorded pain from hundreds of victims. New prisoners were driven insane within hours of exposure to the concentrated suffering that had been stored in the stone walls. Chapter 32: The Biological Clockmakers. Stone Age timekeepers created living clocks using human victims whose bodies were modified to mark time through regular suffering cycles. These biological timepieces were more accurate than any mechanical device because they incorporated natural human rhythms. The modification process involved damaging victims in ways that created predictable pain cycles corresponding to specific time intervals. Their suffering followed precise patterns that tribal timekeepers used to track days, seasons, and ceremonial schedules. These living clocks required constant maintenance to keep their pain cycles regular and accurate. Timekeepers performed regular procedures on the victims to adjust their suffering patterns and maintain temporal precision. Children were preferred for clockmaking because their developing bodies could be more easily trained to follow specific suffering schedules. They spent their entire lives in regulated pain that served as chronometers for their communities. Chapter 33: The Dream Invasion Specialists. Stone Age dream manipulators developed techniques for invading victims' sleep and controlling their dream experiences. These specialists could insert themselves into unconscious minds and create nightmares that continued the torture process even during rest periods. The technique involved keeping victims in specific states of exhaustion while using drugs and rituals to access their dream states. Dream invaders would time their procedures to coincide with victim sleep cycles, maximizing psychological penetration. These dream invasions were often more traumatic than physical torture because victims had no escape, even in unconsciousness. Their sleep became another realm of suffering controlled by their captors, eliminating any possibility of mental recovery. The most skilled dream invaders could create recurring nightmares that persisted for years after the initial procedures. Victims experienced continuous torture that followed them into every moment of rest, breaking down their psychological defenses through relentless mental assault. Chapter 34: The Living Sound Generators. Stone Age musicians discovered that human vocal cords could be surgically modified to produce sounds impossible with normal anatomy. These modified humans became living instruments capable of generating supernatural acoustic effects. The modification process involved reshaping victims' throats, tongues, and respiratory systems while they remained conscious. Multiple surgeries created new resonating chambers and airway configurations that allowed production of otherworldly sounds. These living sound generators were used in warfare to create noises that could drive enemies insane or cause physical damage through acoustic weapons.
Their modified voices produced frequencies that could shatter stone or cause internal injuries in listeners. The most extreme modifications involved connecting multiple victims' respiratory systems to create group instruments. These human orchestras produced coordinated sounds that no individual could generate alone. Their combined suffering creating acoustic weapons of unprecedented power.
Chapter 35: The Memory Palace Builders. Stone Age architects built structures designed to store human memories within their physical framework. These memory palaces incorporated living humans into their construction, using victims' brains as biological storage systems for tribal knowledge. The construction process involved positioning living humans within the building's framework while their brains were surgically accessed and modified. Their memories were systematically replaced with tribal information that needed preservation. These living memory storage systems were accessed through specific rituals that activated the stored knowledge within the victim's modified brains. Tribal historians could retrieve information by triggering responses in the human components of the memory palace. The most sophisticated memory palaces contained hundreds of living humans whose brains had been repurposed as biological libraries. Their consciousness was suppressed while their neural networks served as data storage for their communities.
Chapter 36: The Emotional Amplification Chambers. Stone Age psychologists built chambers designed to amplify human emotions beyond normal limits. These environments could intensify fear, despair, and agony to levels that broke victims' psychological defenses within hours of exposure. The chambers incorporated visual, auditory, and tactile elements that triggered maximum emotional responses. Every surface was designed to evoke specific psychological reactions that combined to create overwhelming emotional experiences. Victims placed in these chambers experienced emotions so intense they became physically damaging. The amplified psychological states could cause organ failure, nervous system damage, and complete mental breakdown within relatively short exposure periods. The most effective chambers were calibrated for specific individuals, using personal information to create customized emotional attacks that targeted victims' particular psychological vulnerabilities with surgical precision.
Chapter 37: The Living Textile Makers. Stone Age weavers discovered that human hair and skin could be harvested continuously from living victims to create textiles with supernatural properties. These human textile farms produced materials that couldn't be replicated with animal products. The harvesting process involved keeping victims alive while systematically removing their hair, skin, and other materials used in textile production. The living harvest was believed to retain spiritual properties that enhance the finished products. These textile farms operated on industrial scales, with hundreds of victims providing continuous raw materials for specialized weaving operations. The victims were kept alive through primitive medical techniques while serving as renewable resources for textile production. The most prized textiles were made from children's materials because their young bodies produced finer, more flexible fibers. Children spent their entire lives as living textile sources, their bodies continuously harvested for materials.
Chapter 38: The Consciousness Transfer Chambers. Stone Age mind transfer specialists built chambers designed to move consciousness from dying bodies into living recipients. These transfer procedures allowed tribal leaders to achieve immortality by inhabiting other people's bodies. The transfer process required precise timing and multiple victims. The dying leader's consciousness was extracted through brain surgery, while recipients were prepared through procedures that made their minds receptive to foreign consciousness. These consciousness transfers often resulted in multiple personalities existing within single bodies. Recipients experienced mental conflict as foreign consciousness battled for control of their physical forms, creating internal wars that drove many victims insane. The most successful transfers involved using children as recipients because their developing minds were more adaptable to foreign consciousness. These children lost their original personalities as they were possessed by the minds of dying tribal leaders. Chapter 39: The Living Compass Networks. Stone Age navigators created networks of living humans whose bodies were modified to respond to magnetic fields across vast distances. These human compass networks allowed long-range communication and navigation through biological magnetism. The network creation process involved implanting iron-rich materials into multiple victims' nervous systems and connecting them through shared trauma experiences. The connected network members could sense each other's locations and transmit simple messages through magnetic field variations. These living compass networks required constant maintenance and calibration through regular torture sessions that synchronized the network members' responses. The shared suffering created psychological bonds that enhanced their magnetic sensitivity. Children were preferred network members because their developing nervous systems showed better integration with the magnetic implants. They were trained from infancy to serve as biological navigation instruments for their communities. Chapter 40: The Pain-Powered Machinery. Stone Age engineers built mechanical devices powered by human suffering. These pain-powered machines used victims' responses to physical and psychological torture as energy sources for various tribal operations. The machines were designed to convert human suffering into mechanical motion through systems of levers, pulleys, and other devices activated by victims' physical responses to pain. The more intense the suffering, the more efficiently the machines operated. These pain-powered devices were used for grinding grain, moving heavy objects, and other labor-intensive tasks. Victims were kept alive and conscious to maintain the energy output that powered tribal technological operations. The most sophisticated pain-powered machines incorporated multiple victims whose suffering was coordinated to provide steady energy output. These human engines operated continuously, powered by the systematic torture of their biological components. Chapter 41: The Living Warning Systems. Stone Age security specialists created alarm systems using living humans whose bodies were modified to detect approaching dangers. These biological sensors provided early warning of threats through their suffering-based responses. The modification process involved damaging victims' sensory systems in ways that made them hypersensitive to specific stimuli associated with danger. Their pain responses provided information about approaching enemies, weather changes, and other threats. These living warning systems were positioned around tribal territories as biological sensor networks. Their responses to various stimuli were interpreted by specialists who used victim suffering as intelligence-gathering tools. The most effective warning systems used children whose nervous systems could be more easily modified for threat detection. They spent their lives in constant pain that intensified when dangers approached, serving as biological early warning systems.
Chapter 42: The Memory Extraction Workshops. Stone Age information gatherers operated facilities designed to extract specific memories from prisoners' brains through surgical procedures. These memory extraction workshops could steal intelligence from enemy captives while keeping them alive for repeated harvesting sessions. The extraction process involved precise trepanation that accessed memory centers while maintaining victim consciousness. Specialists probed different brain regions while interrogating prisoners, physically searching for specific memories within their neural tissue. These workshops could extract tactical information, territorial knowledge, and tribal secrets through direct brain manipulation. The process destroyed victims' personalities while preserving the specific memories that their captors wanted to steal and utilize. Multiple extraction sessions were performed on valuable prisoners, with specialists returning to harvest additional memories as needed. Victims survived these repeated brain surgeries as hollow shells whose minds had been systematically looted.
Chapter 43: The Living Siege Weapons. Stone Age warfare incorporated living humans as biological siege weapons capable of breaching enemy defenses through their suffering-powered mechanisms. These human catapults and battering rams were more effective than mechanical alternatives. The weapon systems used victims' pain responses to generate kinetic energy that could destroy fortifications. Specialized torture devices converted human suffering into mechanical force that powered projectile launchers and wall-breaking equipment. These living siege weapons were transported to battlefields where they were activated through systematic torture of their human components. The weapon's effectiveness increased with the intensity of suffering inflicted on their biological power sources. Enemy fortifications faced psychological warfare as well as physical destruction when attacked by weapons powered by human agony. The screams of the siege weapons victims demoralized defenders, while the suffering-powered machines destroyed their walls.
Chapter 44: The Consciousness Prisons. Stone Age jailers developed techniques for imprisoning victims' consciousness within their own bodies while maintaining physical functionality. These consciousness prisons created aware slaves who could work while experiencing psychological captivity. The imprisonment process involved brain surgery that severed connections between consciousness and voluntary control while maintaining awareness. Victims remained fully conscious but lost the ability to control their own actions. These consciousness prisoners could perform complex tasks while experiencing complete psychological helplessness. They watched their own bodies work for their captors while being unable to resist or escape their mental captivity. The most valuable consciousness prisoners were skilled craftspeople whose expertise could be exploited while their awareness remained trapped within bodies they could no longer control. Their knowledge served their captors while their consciousness suffered endlessly. Chapter 45: The Living Map Makers. Stone Age cartographers created maps using living humans whose bodies were modified to represent geographical features. These human maps provided three-dimensional representations of territories through victim suffering-based responses. The map-making process involved surgical modification of victims' bodies to create scaled representations of landscapes. Different body parts were altered to represent mountains, rivers, and other geographical features through systematic physical transformation. These living maps responded to questions about terrain through pain-based signals that indicated specific geographical information.
Explorers could navigate by inflicting specific tortures that activated different sections of the human maps. The most detailed human maps incorporated multiple victims whose modified bodies represented different aspects of territorial information. These living atlases provided comprehensive geographical knowledge through coordinated suffering of their human components. Chapter 46: The Empathy Reversal Chambers. Stone Age psychologists built chambers that could reverse victims' empathy, making them experience pleasure from others' pain while suffering from acts of kindness. These empathy reversal procedures created psychological monsters from normal humans. The reversal process used environmental manipulation combined with surgical brain modification to rewire emotional responses. Victims were conditioned to associate compassion with pain while finding satisfaction in cruelty. These empathy-reversed individuals became valuable tribal assets because they could inflict suffering without psychological damage. Their reversed emotional responses made them ideal torturers who actually enjoyed their work. The procedure was often performed on prisoners of war to create double agents who would return to their tribes as psychological weapons. Their reversed empathy made them unconsciously destructive to their own communities.
Chapter 47: The Living Time Bombs. Stone Age biological warfare specialists created human time bombs. By infecting victims with delayed-action pathogens designed to activate after specific time periods. These living weapons could destroy enemy tribes from within. The creation process involved carefully timed infections that remained dormant until triggered by specific conditions. Victims appeared healthy while carrying biological weapons that would eventually devastate their communities. These human time bombs were often prisoners who were released back to their tribes carrying dormant diseases. The delayed activation gave the biological weapons time to spread before symptoms appeared. The most sophisticated living time bombs carried multiple pathogens with different activation schedules. They could cause waves of disease that struck enemy populations in carefully planned sequences over extended periods. Chapter 48: The Pain Relay Networks. Stone Age communication systems incorporated networks of living humans who transmitted messages through shared suffering experiences. These pain relay networks could send complex information across vast distances through coordinated torture. The network creation involved connecting multiple victims through shared trauma that synchronized their pain responses. Messages were transmitted by inflicting specific torture patterns on network senders that were felt by receivers. These pain networks could transmit tactical information, warnings, and other communications faster than physical messengers. The shared suffering created empathic connections that allowed complex information transfer through biological channels. The most effective pain networks used family members whose emotional bonds enhanced the suffering transmission. Parents and children were particularly effective network components because their psychological connections amplified the communication signals. Chapter 49: The Living Fuel Generators. Stone Age energy production involved using human fat and other body materials as fuel sources for fires and lamps. Living fuel generators were kept alive while their bodies were harvested for combustible materials. The fuel extraction process involved systematic removal of body fat and other flammable materials while keeping victims alive through primitive medical procedures. The living harvest provided higher quality fuel than materials taken from corpses. These fuel generators were maintained like livestock, fed specific diets that maximized production of combustible body materials. Their living bodies became renewable energy sources that powered tribal lighting and heating systems. The most efficient fuel generators were individuals with high body fat content who were kept immobilized to prevent fuel consumption. They existed solely as living fuel production systems for their communities. Chapter 50: The Consciousness Duplication Experiments. Stone Age mind specialists attempted to create identical copies of human consciousness within multiple bodies. These duplication experiments aimed to preserve valuable individuals by creating backup copies of their minds. The duplication process involved complex brain surgery performed simultaneously on multiple victims while attempting to transfer identical consciousness patterns into each recipient. The procedures had devastating effects on all participants. These experiments often resulted in fragmented consciousness that existed partially in multiple bodies. Victims experienced identity confusion as parts of their minds existed in different physical forms simultaneously. The most ambitious duplication attempts involved copying tribal leaders' consciousness into multiple children. These experiments created psychological monsters who possessed adult memories and experiences within developing bodies. Chapter 51: The Living Artillery Shells. Stone Age siege warfare incorporated living humans as projectiles that could breach enemy fortifications while providing psychological warfare benefits. These human artillery shells were launched at enemy positions using primitive catapults. The preparation process involved modifying victims to survive the launching impact while maximizing their psychological effect on enemy defenders. They were trained to scream during flight and continue fighting after impact. These living projectiles could infiltrate enemy positions and continue attacking from within, while creating terror through their horrific appearance and behavior. They served as both physical weapons and psychological warfare tools. The most effective human artillery shells were prisoners who had been subjected to pain conditioning that made them attack anything they encountered. They became living weapons that continued fighting until destroyed. Chapter 52: The Sensory Overload Chambers. Stone Age torture specialists built chambers designed to overwhelm victims' sensory systems with stimuli that caused permanent psychological damage. These overload chambers could destroy minds without causing obvious physical injury. The chambers incorporated intense light, sound, touch, smell, and taste stimuli that bombarded victims simultaneously. The sensory assault was calibrated to exceed human processing capabilities and cause complete mental breakdown. Victims placed in these chambers experienced sensory input so intense it became physically painful. Their nervous systems were overwhelmed to the point where normal sensory experience became torture even after removal. The most sophisticated overload chambers were customized for individual victims using personal information to create maximum sensory trauma. They targeted specific phobias and sensitivities to maximize psychological destruction. Chapter 53: The Living Anchor Systems. Stone Age maritime technology incorporated living humans as anchor systems for boats and rafts. These human anchors provided better holding power than stone weights while serving additional psychological warfare purposes. The anchor systems involved chaining living prisoners to boat bottoms where they could grab on to underwater obstacles and hold vessels in position. Their desperation to avoid drowning provided superior anchoring force. These living anchors were often prisoners of war who were promised freedom if they successfully anchored their captors' vessels. Their hope for survival motivated them to perform their anchoring duties effectively. The most effective human anchor systems used multiple prisoners chained at different depths. They created anchoring networks that could hold large vessels in position through coordinated underwater suffering.
Chapter 54: The Psychological Virus Creators. Stone Age mental warfare specialists developed techniques for creating psychological contagions that could spread through enemy populations. These psychological viruses used trauma to replicate themselves in new victims. The creation process involved subjecting initial victims to specific trauma patterns designed to make them unconsciously traumatize others. These psychological carriers spread mental damage throughout enemy communities. These psychological viruses were self-replicating trauma systems that grew stronger as they infected more victims. Each new carrier enhanced the virus's ability to spread and cause psychological destruction. The most effective psychological viruses targeted children whose developing minds were more susceptible to trauma infection. They became carriers who unconsciously spread psychological damage throughout their communities for years.
Chapter 55: The Living Shield Generators. Stone Age defensive systems incorporated living humans as biological shields that could absorb enemy attacks while maintaining functionality. These human shields provided protection through their suffering-powered defensive capabilities. The shield systems involved positioning victims between defenders and attackers while keeping them alive to maximize protective effectiveness. Living shields could absorb more damage than dead materials while continuing to function. These human shields were often designed to create psychological barriers as well as physical protection. Enemy attackers faced moral dilemmas when forced to strike through obviously suffering human beings. The most sophisticated shield generators incorporated multiple layers of living protection, with different victims serving specialized defensive functions. They created defensive networks powered by coordinated human suffering.
Chapter 56: The Consciousness Fragmenters. Stone Age mind destroyers developed techniques for fragmenting victims' consciousness into multiple conflicting pieces. These fragmentation procedures created internal psychological warfare that destroyed victims from within. The fragmentation process involved brain surgery combined with psychological manipulation designed to create multiple personality fragments within single minds. Victims experienced internal conflicts that prevented effective resistance. These consciousness fragments often fought each other for control of victims' bodies, creating paralyzed individuals who couldn't function effectively. The internal warfare consumed victims' mental resources and prevented external focus. The most effective fragmentation procedures created fragments with opposing goals and values. Victims became psychological battlefields where different aspects of their personality waged constant internal wars.
Chapter 57: The Living Camouflage Systems. Stone Age stealth technology incorporated living humans as camouflage systems that could adapt to different environments.
These human camouflage networks provided superior concealment through suffering-powered adaptation mechanisms. The camouflage systems involved surgically modifying victims' skin and sensory systems to respond to environmental changes. Their pain responses triggered camouflage adaptations that provided effective concealment. These living camouflage systems could change color, texture, and even scent to match surrounding environments. The adaptations were powered by victims' suffering as their modified bodies responded to external stimuli. Warriors using human camouflage systems became nearly invisible to enemies while benefiting from the psychological advantages of wearing suffering human beings as adaptive concealment technology.
Chapter 58: The Memory Palace Destroyers. Stone Age psychological warfare specialists developed techniques for systematically destroying victims' memory storage systems. These memory destroyers could erase specific memories while leaving others intact to maximize psychological damage. The destruction process involved precise brain surgery that targeted specific memory centers while avoiding others. Victims lost important memories while retaining traumatic experiences that their captors wanted preserved. These memory destruction procedures could erase victims' sense of identity while leaving their skills intact. They became functional slaves who couldn't remember their previous lives or relationships. The most sophisticated memory destroyers could selectively erase positive memories while enhancing traumatic ones. Victims were left with only negative experiences while losing all sources of psychological comfort. Chapter 59: The Living Battery Systems. Stone Age energy storage incorporated living humans as biological batteries that could store and release energy through suffering-powered mechanisms. These human batteries provided reliable power sources for tribal operations. The battery systems involved modifying victims' metabolisms to store energy that could be extracted through systematic torture. Their bodies became living power sources that could be tapped as needed. These human batteries were maintained through specialized feeding and exercise regimens designed to maximize energy storage capacity. They existed solely as biological power sources for their community's technological needs. The most efficient battery systems incorporated multiple victims whose energy outputs were coordinated to provide steady power. They created biological power grids that supplied energy through coordinated human suffering. Chapter 60: The Consciousness Recycling Centers. Stone Age resource management included facilities for recycling human consciousness from dying individuals into new applications. These recycling centers maximize the utility extracted from each human mind before final disposal. The recycling process involved extracting consciousness from dying victims and repurposing it for various tribal needs. Different aspects of personality and memory were separated and reused in specialized applications. These consciousness recycling centers operated like modern recycling facilities, sorting and processing mental materials for reuse in new contexts. Nothing of psychological value was wasted in the recycling process. The most efficient recycling centers could process multiple dying individuals simultaneously, extracting maximum psychological value from each mind before recycling the components into new applications. Chapter 61: The Living Torture Manuals. Stone Age education systems incorporated living humans as instructional materials for teaching torture techniques.
These human manuals provided hands-on training for aspiring torturers while serving as permanent reference materials. The manual creation process involved conditioning victims to demonstrate specific torture responses when triggered by particular stimuli. They became living textbooks that taught torture through interactive demonstration. These human manuals could be consulted repeatedly for technique refinement and training purposes. Students learned torture methods by practicing on the living instructional materials. The most comprehensive torture manuals incorporated multiple victims who demonstrated different aspects of torture technique. They provided complete educational resources for developing expertise in human suffering infliction.
Chapter 62: The Psychological Ecosystems. Stone Age mental warfare incorporated ecosystems that could amplify and reflect psychological attacks back at enemy forces. These ecosystems used victim suffering to create psychological weapons that targeted multiple enemies simultaneously. The ecosystems involved positioning victims in specific formations that created psychological resonance effects. Their coordinated suffering generated psychological attacks that affected entire enemy units. These systems could take psychological attacks directed at them and amplify them back at their sources. Enemy attempts at mental warfare were reflected and intensified through the suffering echo networks. The most effective ecosystems incorporated victims with specific psychological profiles that enhanced the resonance effects. They became psychological amplifiers that turned enemy mental attacks into devastating reflected weapons.
Chapter 63: The Living History Books. Stone Age record-keeping incorporated living humans as historical archives who stored tribal memories within their modified consciousness. These human history books preserved important information through suffering-powered memory systems. The creation process involved replacing victims' personal memories with tribal historical information that needed preservation. Their consciousness became storage systems for important cultural and tactical knowledge. These living history books could be accessed through specific torture procedures that triggered recall of stored information. Tribal historians could retrieve preserved knowledge by inflicting appropriate suffering on the human archives. The most comprehensive history books incorporated multiple victims whose memories had been modified to store different aspects of tribal knowledge. They created living libraries of human information storage systems.
Chapter 64: The Consciousness Transmission Arrays. Stone Age communication technology incorporated arrays of living humans whose consciousness had been modified to transmit thoughts across distances. These transmission arrays provided long-range mental communication through suffering-powered psychic networks. The array creation involved connecting multiple victims through shared trauma that synchronized their consciousness. The psychological bonds created communication channels that could transmit thoughts and emotions across vast distances. These consciousness arrays could send complex information faster than physical messengers, while providing secure communication channels that enemies couldn't intercept. The psychic transmissions were protected by the suffering that powered them. The most effective transmission arrays incorporated family members whose emotional bonds enhanced the psychic connections. Parents and children made particularly effective communication nodes in the consciousness networks. Chapter 65: The Living Mood Regulation Systems. Stone Age psychological management incorporated living humans as mood regulation systems that could control the emotional states of entire communities. These human mood controllers influenced tribal psychology through suffering-powered emotional manipulation. The system creation involved modifying victims' emotional responses to serve as psychological influencers who could affect others' moods. Their suffering created emotional fields that influenced nearby individuals' psychological states. These living mood systems could calm agitated tribes, inspire warriors before battle, or create specific emotional atmospheres for ceremonies. They served as biological psychological control systems for community management. The most effective mood regulation systems incorporated multiple victims whose emotional outputs were coordinated to create specific psychological effects. They provided comprehensive emotional control over entire tribal populations. Chapter 66: The Human Resource Recycling Networks. Stone Age resource management incorporated networks for recycling human materials through multiple use cycles before final disposal. These recycling networks maximize the utility extracted from each human resource. The network operations involved moving victims through different utilization stages, extracting maximum value from their bodies, minds, and suffering capacity. Each recycling stage provided different resources for tribal operations. These recycling networks could process large numbers of victims efficiently, sorting them into appropriate utilization categories based on their physical and psychological characteristics. Nothing human was wasted in the recycling process. The most efficient recycling networks incorporated transportation systems that moved victims between different utilization facilities. They created industrial-scale human resource processing operations. Chapter 67: The Living Environmental Control Systems. Stone Age environmental management incorporated living humans as biological control systems that could regulate temperature, humidity, and air quality. These human environmental controllers modified cave and shelter conditions through suffering-powered biological processes. The control systems involved modifying victims' metabolic processes to generate or absorb heat, moisture, and other environmental factors. Their bodies became biological climate control systems for tribal living spaces. These living environmental controls could maintain optimal conditions for food storage, ceremony performance, and daily activities. They provided biological alternatives to mechanical environmental control systems. The most sophisticated environmental control systems incorporated multiple victims whose biological outputs were coordinated to maintain complex environmental conditions. They created biological climate control networks for entire tribal settlements. Chapter 68: The Consciousness Compression Chambers. Stone Age mental processing incorporated chambers designed to compress human consciousness into concentrated forms that occupied less psychological space. These compression chambers could store multiple minds within single bodies. The compression process involved brain surgery combined with psychological manipulation designed to reduce consciousness to essential components. Victims' minds were compressed while maintaining functionality. These compressed consciousnesses could coexist within single bodies, creating individuals who contained multiple personalities in concentrated forms. The compression allowed more efficient use of human mental resources.
The most effective compression chambers could process multiple victims simultaneously, creating concentrated consciousness storage systems that maximized mental utility within limited physical space.
Chapter 69: The Living Archaeological Preservers. Stone Age cultural preservation incorporated living humans as biological preservation systems for important artifacts and knowledge. These human preservers maintained cultural materials through suffering-powered biological processes. The preservation systems involved modifying victims' body chemistry to create optimal storage conditions for cultural artifacts. Their modified physiology protected important tribal materials from decay and damage. These living preservers carried cultural treasures within their modified bodies, serving as mobile museums that protected important materials while enduring constant pain from the preservation processes. The most valuable preservation systems incorporated multiple victims who stored different aspects of tribal culture. They created living cultural repositories that preserved entire civilizations within suffering human carriers.
Chapter 70: The Psychological Mining Operations. Stone Age mental resource extraction incorporated mining operations that could extract valuable psychological materials from victims' consciousness. These mining operations harvested mental resources like emotions, memories, and personality traits. The mining process involves systematic extraction of specific psychological components while keeping victims alive to continue production. Different mental materials were harvested through specialized extraction procedures. These psychological mines could produce fear, anger, despair, and other emotions in concentrated forms that were used for various tribal purposes. The extracted emotions became raw materials for psychological warfare. The most productive mining operations incorporated multiple victims whose psychological outputs were coordinated to maximize mental resource extraction. They created industrial-scale psychological harvesting systems. Chapter 71: The Living Command Centers. Stone Age military operations incorporated living humans as biological command centers that could coordinate complex tactical operations. These human command systems provided superior battlefield coordination through suffering-powered information processing. The command systems involved modifying victims' brains to serve as biological computers that could process tactical information and coordinate military operations. Their consciousness became military processing systems. These living command centers could manage multiple battlefield operations simultaneously while providing real-time tactical analysis. They served as biological alternatives to primitive mechanical command systems. The most sophisticated command centers incorporated multiple victims whose processing capabilities were networked together. They created biological command networks that could coordinate large-scale military operations. Chapter 72: The Consciousness Backup Systems. Stone Age data preservation incorporated backup systems that could store copies of human consciousness for recovery after primary death. These backup systems provided psychological immortality through suffering-powered consciousness storage. The backup creation involved copying victims' consciousness into secondary storage systems while keeping the original conscious. Multiple copies of the same mind existed simultaneously in different forms. These consciousness backups could be activated if the primary individual died, providing continuity of personality and memory. They served as psychological insurance systems for important tribal members. The most advanced backup systems incorporated multiple storage methods that preserved consciousness in different formats. They created redundant psychological preservation systems that guaranteed mental survival.
Chapter 73: The Living Quality Control Systems. Stone Age manufacturing incorporated living humans as quality control systems that could evaluate products through suffering-based testing procedures. These human quality controllers provided superior product evaluation through biological testing methods. The quality control systems involved using victims' pain responses to test product effectiveness, safety, and quality. Their suffering provided feedback about product performance that couldn't be obtained through other testing methods. These living quality controllers were subjected to systematic testing procedures that evaluated all aspects of tribal manufacturing output. Their pain responses indicated product defects and quality variations. The most effective quality control systems incorporated multiple victims who tested different product aspects simultaneously. They created biological quality assurance networks that maintained high manufacturing standards. Chapter 74: The Psychological Waste Disposal Networks. Stone Age mental hygiene incorporated waste disposal networks that could process and eliminate unwanted psychological materials. These disposal networks handled mental waste through suffering-powered psychological processing systems. The disposal networks involved transferring unwanted emotions, memories, and personality traits from tribal members into victim processors who absorbed and contained the psychological waste. These psychological waste processors became repositories for unwanted mental materials that would otherwise contaminate tribal psychological environments. They served as biological psychological sewage systems. The most efficient disposal networks incorporated multiple victim processors who specialized in different types of psychological waste. They created comprehensive mental waste management systems for entire tribal communities. Chapter 75: The Living Training Simulators. Stone Age education incorporated living humans as training simulators that could provide realistic practice scenarios for warriors and specialists. These human simulators offered superior training through suffering-powered interactive experiences. The simulator systems involved conditioning victims to respond to training scenarios in specific ways that provided realistic practice opportunities. They became living training equipment for skill development. These human simulators could provide combat training, torture technique practice, and other specialized skill development through interactive suffering experiences. They served as biological alternatives to mechanical training systems. The most comprehensive training simulators incorporated multiple victims who provided different training scenarios simultaneously. They created biological training facilities that offered complete skill development programs. Chapter 76: The Consciousness Distribution Networks. Stone Age psychological management incorporated distribution networks that could share consciousness among multiple individuals. These distribution systems allowed tribal leaders to extend their awareness through suffering-powered psychological sharing. The distribution networks involved connecting multiple victims through shared consciousness systems that allowed leaders to experience multiple perspectives simultaneously.
Their awareness expanded through psychological networking. These consciousness distribution systems provided enhanced situational awareness and decision-making capabilities through shared psychological experiences. They served as biological intelligence amplification systems. The most sophisticated distribution networks incorporated hundreds of victims whose consciousness was networked together. They created vast psychological sharing systems that extended individual awareness across entire tribal populations.
Chapter 77, The Living Performance Evaluators. Stone Age personnel management incorporated living humans as performance evaluation systems that could assess tribal members' effectiveness. These human evaluators provided superior assessment through suffering-powered psychological analysis. The evaluation systems involved using victims' pain responses to test tribal members' skills, loyalty, and effectiveness. Their suffering provided feedback about personnel performance that guided tribal management decisions. These living evaluators were subjected to systematic testing procedures that evaluated all aspects of tribal member performance. Their responses indicated competency levels and areas needing improvement. The most comprehensive evaluation systems incorporated multiple victims who assessed different performance aspects simultaneously. They created biological personnel management systems that maintained optimal tribal efficiency. Chapter 78, The Psychological Energy Converters. Stone Age power systems incorporated energy converters that could transform human suffering into usable power sources. These conversion systems provided renewable energy through suffering-powered psychological processes. The converter systems involved channeling victims' psychological pain into energy forms that could power tribal operations. Their suffering became fuel for various technological and magical applications. These psychological energy converters could provide continuous power as long as victims remained alive and conscious. They served as biological power plants that generated energy through systematic torture. The most efficient converter systems incorporated multiple victims whose suffering was coordinated to provide steady energy output. They created biological power grids that supplied consistent energy through coordinated psychological pain. Chapter 79, The Living Inventory Control Systems. Stone Age resource management incorporated living humans as inventory control systems that could track and manage tribal resources. These human controllers provided superior resource management through suffering-powered information processing. The control systems involved modifying victims' consciousness to serve as biological databases that tracked resource locations, quantities, and conditions. Their minds became living inventory management systems. These human inventory controllers could provide real-time resource information while alerting tribal managers to supply shortages and distribution needs. They served as biological alternatives to primitive record-keeping systems. The most comprehensive inventory systems incorporated multiple victims who tracked different resource categories simultaneously. They created biological resource management networks that maintained complete tribal supply oversight. Chapter 80, The Consciousness Synthesis Laboratories. Stone Age psychological research incorporated laboratories that could synthesize new forms of consciousness from existing mental materials.
These synthesis labs created artificial personalities through suffering-powered consciousness manipulation. The synthesis process involved combining psychological components from multiple victims to create new consciousness forms with desired characteristics. Different personality traits were extracted and recombined systematically. These consciousness synthesis laboratories could produce specialized personalities for specific tribal needs, creating individuals with optimal psychological profiles for particular tasks. The most advanced synthesis labs incorporated multiple processing stations that could create different consciousness types simultaneously. They created biological personality manufacturing systems that produced customized human resources.
Chapter 81: The Living Logistics Networks. Stone Age supply management incorporated living humans as logistics networks that could coordinate resource movement and distribution. These human logistics systems provided superior supply chain management through suffering-powered coordination. The logistics networks involved connecting multiple victims through shared suffering that synchronized their coordination capabilities. Their psychological bonds created supply chain management systems. These living logistics networks could coordinate complex resource movements while optimizing distribution efficiency. They served as biological alternatives to primitive supply management systems. The most sophisticated logistics networks incorporated hundreds of victims whose coordination was synchronized through shared trauma. They created vast biological supply chains that managed tribal resource distribution. Chapter 82: The Psychological Assembly Lines. Stone Age manufacturing incorporated assembly lines that used living humans as production components. These human assembly systems provided superior manufacturing through suffering-powered production processes. The assembly line systems involved positioning victims at different production stages where their suffering powered specific manufacturing operations. Each victim contributed to product creation through systematic torture. These psychological assembly lines could produce complex items through coordinated victim suffering that powered different manufacturing stages. They served as biological alternatives to primitive mechanical production. The most efficient assembly lines incorporated dozens of victims whose suffering was synchronized to optimize production efficiency. They created biological manufacturing systems that produced tribal goods through coordinated human pain. Chapter 83: The Living Research Laboratories. Stone Age scientific development incorporated living humans as research laboratories that could test hypotheses through suffering-powered experimentation. These human labs provided superior research capabilities through biological testing methods. The laboratory systems involved using victims as experimental subjects and testing apparatus simultaneously. Their suffering provided research data, while their bodies served as experimental equipment. These living research laboratories could conduct multiple experiments simultaneously while providing real-time data about hypothesis validity. They served as biological alternatives to primitive scientific equipment. The most comprehensive research labs incorporated multiple victim laboratories that specialized in different research areas. They created biological research networks that advanced tribal scientific knowledge through systematic human experimentation. Chapter 84: The Consciousness Optimization Centers. Stone Age mental enhancement incorporated optimization centers that could improve human consciousness through suffering-powered psychological modification. These centers enhanced mental capabilities while extracting maximum utility from human resources. The optimization process involved systematic psychological modification that improved victims' mental capabilities while making them more useful to tribal operations. Their enhanced consciousness served specialized functions. These consciousness optimization centers could produce individuals with superior mental abilities specifically designed for particular tribal needs. They served as biological enhancement facilities for human resource development. The most advanced optimization centers incorporated multiple processing stations that could enhance different mental capabilities simultaneously. They created biological enhancement networks that improved tribal human resources.
Chapter 85: The Living Maintenance Systems. Stone Age infrastructure management incorporated living humans as maintenance systems that could repair and maintain tribal facilities. These human maintenance systems provided superior facility management through suffering-powered biological processes. The maintenance systems involved modifying victims' bodies to serve as biological repair mechanisms for tribal infrastructure. Their suffering powered maintenance operations that kept facilities functional. These living maintenance systems could provide continuous facility upkeep while alerting managers to problems and repair needs. They served as biological alternatives to primitive maintenance tools. The most comprehensive maintenance systems incorporated multiple victims who specialized in different facility aspects. They created biological maintenance networks that maintained entire tribal infrastructure systems. Chapter 86: The Psychological Distribution Centers. Stone Age mental resource management incorporated distribution centers that could allocate psychological materials among tribal members. These centers managed mental resource distribution through suffering-powered psychological logistics. The distribution systems involved processing psychological materials extracted from victims and allocating them to tribal members based on need and priority. Mental resources were distributed like physical supplies. These psychological distribution centers could provide specialized mental materials to individuals requiring specific psychological enhancements. They served as biological mental resource management systems. The most efficient distribution centers incorporated multiple processing stations that could handle different psychological materials simultaneously. They created mental supply chains that distributed psychological resources throughout tribal populations. Chapter 87: The Living Documentation Systems. Stone Age record-keeping incorporated living humans as documentation systems that could store and retrieve information through suffering-powered memory processes. These human archives provided superior information management. The documentation systems involved modifying victims' memories to serve as biological databases that stored important tribal information. Their consciousness became living filing systems. These human documentation systems could provide instant access to stored information while maintaining data security through psychological protection mechanisms. They served as biological alternatives to primitive record-keeping methods. The most comprehensive documentation systems incorporated multiple victim archives who specialized in different information categories. They created biological information management networks that stored complete tribal knowledge. Chapter 88: The Consciousness Quality Assurance Networks. Stone Age psychological production incorporated quality assurance networks that could evaluate and improve consciousness manufacturing processes. These networks ensured optimal psychological output through suffering-powered quality control. The quality assurance systems involved testing consciousness products through systematic evaluation procedures that used victim suffering to identify defects and improvements. Quality control was maintained through biological testing. These consciousness quality networks could provide continuous monitoring of psychological manufacturing while implementing improvements to enhance product quality. They served as biological quality management systems. The most sophisticated quality networks incorporated multiple testing stations that could evaluate different consciousness aspects simultaneously. They created comprehensive biological quality assurance systems. Chapter 89. The Living Customer Service Centers. Stone Age tribal management incorporated living humans as customer service centers that could handle complaints and requests through suffering-powered communication systems. These human service centers provided superior tribal member support. The service systems involved training victims to respond to tribal member needs while their suffering-powered communication and problem-solving processes. They became biological customer service representatives. These living service centers could handle multiple tribal member requests simultaneously while providing personalized assistance through suffering-enhanced empathy and responsiveness. They served as biological support systems. The most comprehensive service centers incorporated multiple victim representatives who specialized in different service areas. They created biological customer support networks that maintained tribal member satisfaction.
Chapter 90. The Psychological Export Processing Facilities. Stone Age trade operations incorporated processing facilities that could prepare psychological products for export to other tribes. These facilities processed mental materials through suffering-powered production systems. The processing systems involved refining psychological materials extracted from victims into forms suitable for trade with other tribal groups. Mental products were prepared like physical trade goods. These psychological export facilities could produce specialized mental materials that commanded high trade values with other tribes. They served as biological psychological manufacturing for trade purposes. The most efficient export facilities incorporated multiple processing lines that could produce different psychological products simultaneously. They created biological export industries based on systematic human consciousness processing.
Chapter 91. The Living Technical Support Networks. Stone Age technology management incorporated living humans as technical support networks that could troubleshoot and maintain complex systems. These human support systems provided superior technical assistance through suffering-powered problem-solving. The support networks involved training victims to diagnose and repair tribal technologies while their suffering enhanced their technical capabilities and motivation. They became biological technical support specialists. These living technical networks could provide continuous system maintenance while rapidly responding to technical problems throughout tribal operations. They served as biological alternatives to primitive technical support. The most comprehensive support networks incorporated multiple specialist victims who handled different technical areas simultaneously. They created biological technical support systems that maintained optimal tribal technological performance. Chapter 92. The Consciousness Import Processing Centers that could integrate foreign consciousness materials into tribal psychological systems. These centers processed imported mental products through suffering-powered integration procedures. The processing systems involved modifying imported psychological materials to be compatible with tribal consciousness systems while using victim suffering to power the integration processes. These import processing centers could adapt foreign mental products for tribal use while maintaining quality and safety standards. They served as biological psychological import management systems. The most sophisticated processing centers incorporated multiple integration stations that could handle different imported consciousness types simultaneously. They created comprehensive biological import systems for psychological trade materials. Chapter 93. The Living Performance Monitoring Systems. Stone Age operational management incorporated living humans as performance monitoring systems that could track tribal efficiency through suffering-powered analytical processes. These human monitors provided superior performance oversight. The monitoring systems involved positioning victims throughout tribal operations where their suffering-enhanced awareness could detect performance problems and optimization opportunities. They became biological performance sensors. These living monitoring systems could provide real-time performance data while alerting managers to efficiency problems and improvement opportunities. They served as biological alternatives to primitive performance measurement. The most comprehensive monitoring systems incorporated networks of victim sensors who specialized in different operational areas. They created biological performance monitoring networks that optimized entire tribal operations.
Chapter 94. The Psychological Troubleshooting Centers. Stone Age Problem-Solving incorporated troubleshooting centers that could diagnose and resolve complex psychological problems through suffering-powered analytical processes. These centers provided superior problem resolution. The troubleshooting systems involved using victims' suffering-enhanced analytical capabilities to identify and solve psychological problems affecting tribal operations. Their pain powered superior problem-solving abilities. These psychological troubleshooting centers could resolve complex mental problems while providing solutions that prevented similar issues from recurring. They served as biological problem-solving systems. The most advanced troubleshooting centers incorporated multiple analyst victims who specialized in different problem types. They created biological problem-solving networks that maintained optimal tribal psychological functioning. Keep the pace lively, moving the story forward while letting key moments breathe. The integration networks involved connecting victims across different tribal systems to create coordination mechanisms powered by their shared suffering. They became biological system integration specialists. These living integration networks could coordinate complex tribal operations while optimizing system interactions and efficiency. They served as biological alternatives to primitive coordination methods. The most sophisticated integration networks incorporated hundreds of victim integrators who specialized in different system types. They created comprehensive biological integration systems that coordinated entire tribal civilizations. Chapter 96. The Consciousness Retirement Processing Facilities. Stone Age human resource management incorporated retirement processing facilities that could extract maximum value from aging consciousness before disposal. These facilities processed retiring mental resources through suffering-powered extraction procedures. The retirement systems involved systematically extracting all remaining psychological value from aging victims before their final disposal. Every memory, skill, and emotional capacity was harvested through suffering-powered extraction procedures. These consciousness retirement facilities could process multiple aging victims simultaneously while maximizing the psychological materials extracted from their declining mental resources. They served as biological resource recovery systems. The most efficient retirement facilities incorporated multiple extraction stations that could harvest different mental materials simultaneously. They created comprehensive biological recycling systems that extracted maximum value from retiring human consciousness.
Chapter 97: The Living Emergency Response Systems. Stone Age crisis management incorporated living humans as emergency response systems that could react to threats through suffering-powered rapid response mechanisms. These human emergency systems provided superior crisis management capabilities. The response systems involved positioning victims throughout tribal territories where their suffering-enhanced awareness could detect emergencies and coordinate rapid response actions. They became biological emergency sensors and coordinators. These living emergency systems could provide instant threat detection while coordinating response efforts through suffering-powered communication networks. They served as biological alternatives to primitive emergency management. The most comprehensive emergency systems incorporated networks of victim responders who specialized in different crisis types. They created biological emergency management systems that protected entire tribal populations through coordinated human suffering.
Chapter 98: The Psychological Disposal and Recycling Networks. Stone Age waste management incorporated comprehensive networks that could process and recycle all forms of psychological waste while extracting maximum value. These networks handled mental waste through suffering-powered processing systems. The disposal networks involved multiple processing stages that broke down psychological waste into reusable components while using victim suffering to power the recycling operations. Nothing mental was permanently wasted. These psychological disposal networks could handle large volumes of mental waste while producing recycled psychological materials for reuse in tribal operations. They served as biological mental waste management systems. The most sophisticated disposal networks incorporated industrial-scale processing facilities that could handle psychological waste from entire tribal civilizations. They created comprehensive mental recycling systems that maintained psychological environmental cleanliness. Chapter 99: The Living Legacy Preservation Systems. Stone Age cultural continuity incorporated living humans as legacy preservation systems that could maintain tribal traditions through suffering-powered cultural transmission. These human preservers ensured cultural survival across generations. The preservation systems involved modifying victims to serve as living repositories of tribal culture, traditions, and knowledge. Their suffering powered the preservation processes that maintained cultural materials indefinitely. These living legacy systems could transmit cultural knowledge to new generations while maintaining the authentic suffering that originally created the cultural materials. They served as biological cultural preservation networks.
The most comprehensive legacy systems incorporated multiple preservation specialists who maintained different cultural aspects simultaneously. They created biological cultural preservation networks that ensured tribal civilization survival through systematic human suffering.
Chapter 100: The Consciousness Transcendence Laboratories. Stone Age spiritual development incorporated laboratories that could transcend normal consciousness limitations through suffering-powered psychological enhancement. These transcendence labs created superhuman awareness through systematic consciousness modification. The transcendence process involved pushing victims' consciousness beyond normal human limits through extreme suffering that broke psychological barriers and created enhanced awareness states. Pain became the pathway to transcendence. These consciousness transcendence laboratories could produce individuals with supernatural mental capabilities that exceeded normal human psychological limitations. They served as biological spiritual advancement systems. The most advanced transcendence labs incorporated multiple enhancement stations that could create different transcendent consciousness types simultaneously. They created biological spiritual development systems that produced superhuman psychological capabilities. Chapter 101: The Living Eternity Engines. Stone Age immortality research incorporated living humans as eternity engines that could extend consciousness indefinitely through suffering-powered life extension mechanisms. These human engines provided pathways to psychological immortality. The eternity systems involved modifying victims' consciousness to exist in extended time states where psychological time moved differently from physical time. Their suffering powered temporal manipulation that extended awareness indefinitely. These living eternity engines could maintain consciousness for extended periods while experiencing compressed time that allowed infinite psychological experiences within finite physical time frames. They served as biological immortality systems. The most sophisticated eternity engines incorporated multiple temporal processing stations that could create different time experiences simultaneously. They created biological time manipulation systems that provided various forms of psychological immortality. Chapter 102: The Psychological Infinity Generators. Stone Age consciousness expansion incorporated infinity generators that could create unlimited psychological experiences through suffering-powered consciousness multiplication. These generators produced infinite mental experiences within finite human minds. The infinity systems involved expanding victims' consciousness to accommodate unlimited experiences, while their suffering powered the psychological multiplication processes that created infinite mental capacity. These psychological infinity generators could produce limitless mental experiences while maintaining individual consciousness integrity through suffering-enhanced psychological expansion techniques. They served as biological consciousness multiplication systems. The most advanced infinity generators incorporated multiple expansion chambers that could create different infinite experiences simultaneously. They created comprehensive biological infinity systems that provided unlimited psychological experiences. Chapter 103: The Living Reality Manipulation Networks.
Stone Age reality control incorporated living humans as reality manipulation networks that could alter physical reality through suffering-powered consciousness projection. These human networks provided supernatural control over physical existence. The manipulation networks involved connecting multiple victims whose combined consciousness could influence physical reality through coordinated suffering that powered reality alteration abilities. Their pain became reality-shaping force. These living reality networks could modify physical laws while creating desired outcomes through suffering-enhanced consciousness manipulation of reality structures. They served as biological reality control systems. The most powerful reality networks incorporated hundreds of victim manipulators whose consciousness was coordinated to create massive reality alterations. They created biological reality control systems that could reshape entire physical environments. Chapter 104: The Consciousness Omnipotence Chambers. Stone Age Ultimate Power Research incorporated omnipotence chambers that could grant unlimited power through suffering-powered consciousness enhancement. These chambers created godlike abilities through systematic psychological transformation. The omnipotence process involved expanding victims' consciousness to encompass unlimited power, while their extreme suffering powered the transformation that granted supernatural abilities exceeding normal human limitations. These consciousness omnipotence chambers could create individuals with godlike powers while maintaining their human consciousness through suffering-enhanced psychological expansion that bridged human and divine awareness. The most advanced omnipotence chambers incorporated multiple power enhancement stations that could grant different supernatural abilities simultaneously. They created biological God-making systems that produced superhuman beings. Chapter 105: The Living Universe Integration Systems. Stone Age cosmic consciousness research incorporated living humans as universe integration systems that could merge individual awareness with cosmic consciousness. These integration systems provided pathways to universal awareness. The integration process involved expanding victims' consciousness to encompass universal awareness, while their suffering powered the merger with cosmic consciousness that transcended individual limitations. These universe integration systems could create individuals whose consciousness encompassed entire universes while maintaining personal identity through suffering-enhanced cosmic awareness expansion techniques. The most sophisticated integration systems incorporated multiple cosmic consciousness stations that could create different universal awareness types simultaneously. They created biological cosmic consciousness systems.
Chapter 106: The Psychological Godhood Laboratories. Stone Age Divinity Research incorporated laboratories that could transform human consciousness into divine awareness through suffering-powered psychological apotheosis. These Godhood labs created divine consciousness through systematic human transformation. The apotheosis process involved elevating victims' consciousness to divine levels, while their extreme suffering powered the transformation from human to godlike awareness that transcended mortal limitations.
These psychological godhood laboratories could create divine beings while maintaining aspects of human consciousness through suffering-enhanced divinity transformation that bridged mortal and immortal awareness. The most advanced godhood labs incorporated multiple divinity enhancement stations that could create different types of gods simultaneously. They created biological God manufacturing systems. Chapter 107: The Living Absolute Power Networks. Stone Age Ultimate Authority research incorporated living humans as absolute power networks that could grant unlimited authority over existence. These networks provided supreme control through suffering-powered consciousness enhancement. The absolute power systems involved connecting multiple victims whose combined consciousness could exercise unlimited control over reality through coordinated suffering that powered supreme authority abilities. These living absolute power networks could control all aspects of existence while maintaining consciousness coherence through suffering-enhanced authority expansion that granted supreme power over reality. The most powerful absolute power networks incorporated thousands of victim controllers whose consciousness was coordinated to exercise complete control over existence itself. Chapter 108: The Consciousness Beyond Infinity Systems. Stone Age transcendental research incorporated systems that could expand consciousness beyond infinite limitations through suffering-powered psychological transcendence. These beyond infinity systems created awareness that exceeded even unlimited experiences. The transcendence process involved expanding victims' consciousness beyond infinite boundaries, while their suffering powered psychological transformation that transcended even unlimited awareness states. These consciousness beyond infinity systems could create awareness that exceeded infinite limitations while maintaining individual identity through suffering-enhanced transcendental expansion techniques. The most advanced beyond infinity systems incorporated multiple transcendence stations that could create different trans-infinite consciousness types simultaneously. They created biological transcendence systems that exceeded all limitations. Chapter 109: The Living Ultimate Reality Chambers. Stone Age final reality research incorporated living humans as ultimate reality chambers that could access the fundamental nature of existence through suffering-powered consciousness penetration. These chambers provided access to ultimate truth. The ultimate reality process involved using victims' consciousness to penetrate the deepest levels of existence, while their suffering powered the psychological journey into ultimate reality. These living ultimate reality chambers could reveal the fundamental nature of existence while maintaining consciousness coherence through suffering-enhanced reality penetration that accessed ultimate truth. The most sophisticated ultimate reality chambers incorporated multiple reality exploration stations that could access different aspects of ultimate existence simultaneously. Chapter 110: The Eternal Suffering Engines. The final Stone Age discovery was the most horrific of all. Deep beneath the earth, archaeologists found chambers containing victims who had been kept alive for thousands of years through primitive life extension techniques, their consciousness trapped in eternal suffering. These eternal engines represented the ultimate achievement of Stone Age cruelty, the ability to make suffering truly infinite.
The victims experienced every moment of their extended existence as pure agony, with no hope of death or escape. The preservation techniques involved constant medical intervention that prevented death while maintaining full consciousness and pain sensitivity. These victims had experienced more suffering than entire civilizations combined, their individual agony exceeding all historical trauma. The most disturbing aspect was the discovery that these eternal suffering engines were still active when found. The victims remained conscious after millennia of continuous torture, their screams echoing through chambers that had contained their agony for longer than recorded human history.